Moving along, let's see something called as the constructor function. To define a constructor function in a student class, we have to say student, that is the class name, and define all the default values for all the variables of the student class. First of all, let's understand the use of the constructor function. The constructor function is called whenever we use the new keyword. As we said, student S1 equals to new student. Whenever we use the new keyword, the constructor function is called. You might be thinking that until now we didn't have the constructor function, but we were able to say student S1 equals to new student. That is because Java provides a by default constructor function or a blank constructor function for each class. If we want our own constructor for a class, then we have to define it the way it is shown in the slide. We have to define the constructor function with the same name as the name of the class. In this case, the name of the class was student, so we defined the function by saying student. And inside the constructor function, we have to perform all the initializations of all the variables that are used in a class. For example, the initial value of name is nothing, so we say name equals to double quotes, double quotes. That indicates that name is a blank variable having no value. Roll number should be 0, address should be blank, contact number should be blank, branch should be blank. So whenever we define or whenever we call new student, a new student will be formed and you will be getting all the default values of all the variables for this student. So you can test this functionality with the help of a program. Let's go through some basic programming syntax of Java. We have the if conditionals. If indicates that this is a decision making block. If you want to perform some decisions using the programming language, then you can do it with the help of if conditionals. For example, if I want to check if a person can vote or not, I will say if age is more than 0 and age is less than 18. That indicates that if the age of the person is more than 0 and if the age is less than 18, then you can say system.out.println you cannot vote, that is, the person is not eligible to vote. Else, if the age is more than or equal to 18, then you can say system.out.println you can vote. Else you can say system.out.println enter proper age. The for loop. Whenever you want to perform a series of operations, then you use something called as a for loop. For loops are used mainly to repeat statements. This is already done with the C language, and it follows the same syntax over here as well. So if I want to use a loop that goes from 0 to 9, so I'll use the syntax for count equals to 0, count is less than 10, count plus plus. That indicates that start the value of count with 0, loop this thing until count becomes 10 or until count is less than 10, and increment the value of count by 1 by saying count plus plus. Inside this, we'll just print out count as count. So we'll get the output as count 0, count 1, count 2, count 3, count 4, count 5, count 6, count 7, count 8, count 9. This was about the for loop. Then we have something called a switch statement. Whenever we perform menu based programs, then we use switch statements, or when the number of inputs are restricted, that is, the number of values at the input are restricted. At that case, we use the switch statement. So it's correctly said, it is used when we need to perform a task on a variable whose number of values are fixed. For example, if we have given a user a choice to exit our program or not, so we'll just switch choice, case Y, we will say system.out.println exiting the program. Say case N, it says cancel option, and if the user enters apart from Y and N, then we have something called as default. Here we will put at the output invalid option. That indicates that this option that you have entered is invalid. Now here there are some points to mark. First of all, when you say switch choice, in that case all the choices that you want to mention, you have to use the case statement for that. For example, here we had switch choice, case y, case n, etc. At the end of every case you must have a break statement. That break statement indicates that the work of this case is over. Now jump to the next case. Okay, so that break statement is very compulsory. If you will not have the break statement in place, then the code from that case statement until the end, until it finds the break statement, will be executed and the program might misbehave. So always have case and break. Case for the starting of the case and break to end the case statement. Now with Java you have something called as the for each loop. The for each loop was introduced to go through arrays in a much systematic manner. For example, if we have an array of names having 4 names, say Pankaj, Sagar, Akash and Pooja, then if we want to go through each of these names through a for each loop, we have to say for in bracket string name in names. Okay, so you have to read it like this: for each string name in names system.out.println name. So what this loop will do is, this will go through the names array and put each value of the names array one by one inside the name variable. We'll print this thing value inside the loop so that we print out Pankaj, then Sagar, then Akash, then Pooja. Once the loop is over, the names array will be finished and the control will jump out of the loop. Okay, so this is a very good technique of iterating through any array. Now, one and most important feature of the Java programming language is to suppress runtime errors. Now let us first understand what are runtime errors. In certain cases, there can be runtime errors in our code. For example, if we accidentally divide a number by 0 in a complete statement, there are times where we will be using division, and in case of division, if the divisor is 0, in that case what will happen is anything divided by 0 is infinity. But Java does not support infinity, so it will throw you an error. That is a runtime error. Okay, you cannot use that error at compile time, because at compile time you will not know that such an error can occur, but at runtime such errors can occur. One more example is if we try to access a resource which is not present, like a file, etc. For example, if you are trying to copy something from C drive to F drive, where F drive is a USB device, and someone accidentally plugs out that device while a file transfer is in progress, so that will give you a runtime error. Now in such cases, Java provides us with something called as a try catch block. The meaning of this block is try bracket open, and you do some statements over there, try this, and in case of a runtime error is also called as an exception, so you catch that exception, and in case of the error you do this. So the main utility of this block is to avoid mistime termination of your program. So in case your program is running beautifully and at some point there is a runtime error, that runtime error should not close your program, but it should warn the user that something has gone wrong. Now you have to correct this thing and then you have to continue. Okay, so this is the main utility of the program. Let's take an example of runtime errors. We'll have a class called as error test. The name doesn't matter, you can have any name for the class. We have int num1, int num2, and let's try to give some values to num1 and num2, and now try to print this thing out. So we'll say system.out.println num1 divided by num2. Now this statement will raise an error. It will say that in red line, in a red color, that this statement has caused some error or a runtime error or an exception. So to remove this error, we have to replace the above code with try catch. Okay, now see, in the complete program, the place where error can be is where you have divided num1 by num2. So we have to put this statement inside a try catch block. So we'll say try system.out.println num1 by num2. In case there's an error over here, catch that error and print out the message that you get from that error. So we have ex as the object of the exception class. So whenever you have an error, an exception is thrown, you catch that exception over here and you just print out the message from that exception. Okay, so let's try to do this thing. Let's do it for the constructor function. In the constructor function, we have to define a function with the same name as that of the class name. So here the class name is student. So just copy this thing up and paste it over here. Because this is a function, so we have to have a starting bracket and an ending bracket, a starting brace and an ending brace. Inside the constructor function, you have to define the initial values of all the properties. So I'll say name equals to nothing. I'll say roll number equals to 0. Branch equals to say computer science. I'll say contact equals to nothing, and other information equals to say nothing. Okay, so whenever you will create a new student, it will create it by default by all these properties. So if you will not fill any property inside the student class, all the properties will be blank. 0, CSE, contact, and other information is also blank. So let's test this thing out. I'll remove everything from here and I'll say student s equals to new student. Okay, so whenever I say new student, this call will actually call the constructor function, and the constructor function will define all the properties. To make sure that the constructor function is called, we can just have a system.out.println and I'll say constructor function has been called. So whenever you will be calling this constructor function, it will be giving you at the output constructor function has been called. And how do we call the constructor function? By just creating a new object. Okay, so if I'll say student s1 equals to new student, so at this time the constructor function will be called 2 times. So I'll get at the output constructor function has been called, constructor function has been called. This first output is because of this statement, because it says student s equals to new student, so it will jump the loop where to the constructor function of the student class, and it will give at the output constructor function has been called. Similarly, s1 equals to new student, this will also call the constructor function and you'll get at the output constructor function has been called. So this was about the constructor function, and as you can see, by default we have kept the branch as CSE. So if I'll try to print out the branch of s dot branch, so I'll get at the output CSE. Got that? Because the default value of the branch was kept as CSE. This was about the constructor function. Now let's start with the basic programming syntax. First of all, we have to check out how do we have the if else in Java. I'll just define integer age equals to say 21. If age is more than 0 and age is less than 18, so I have to say SYSO, you cannot vote. I'll say else if age is more than or equal to 18 and age is less than 175, so I'll say you can vote. Similarly, if there is the age is outside the range, so I'll say invalid age. Let's try to run the thing. What should be the output? Age is 21, so it's falling inside this category, so it will give the output you can vote. Fine. If I'll give the age as 5 years, let's try to run this thing. We'll say you cannot vote. If I'll give the age as minus 5 years, it will give the output as invalid age. This was about the if statements. Let's try to test for each loop. I'll say char choice equals to y. Let's say switch choice. You can give case y. I'll say exiting the program. Okay. You have to have a break statement. Then you'll say case n cancel option break. I'll say case, or you can just say default. Default indicates if you haven't given the value y or n, it will come to default. I'll say invalid choice. Okay, let's run this thing. What should be the output? The output should be exiting the program. Okay, now if I'll give the choice as n, it should give me cancel option. If you will give the choice as something else, say a, it will give invalid choice. Okay, this was about the switch case statement. Let's try to use the for loop. Let's remove this code from here. I'll say int count for count equals to 0, count is less than 10, count plus plus. This is same as C. I'll just say system.out.println count plus count. The plus statement will not add anything, it will just combine two strings. So you'll get at the output 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. As you can see, the output is correctly count 0, count 1, count 2, count 3 up to count 9. This was about the for loop. We learned something called as for each loop as well. So I have string names equals to, let's define some names, Pankaj, Sagar, Akash, Pooja, and say Archana. Okay, over here I have two ways to access this complete array. One way is to define a for loop, as we have been doing. For I equals to 0, I is less than, how many names we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'll say I less than 5, and then I plus plus. I'll say print out names of I. Okay, it will do the same thing. It will give the output as Pankaj, Sagar, Akash, Pooja, Archana. But understand how many variables are being used here. You are using the variable I, you are initializing the value of I, you are incrementing the value of I, you are checking the value of I for some range, and you are also putting the value of I in an index. Okay, so here you are using the variable I very heavily. To remove this thing, Java has given you a for each loop. A for each loop can be defined like for string name in names. This indicates that for each name inside the array names, just print that thing out. It will give the same output, but as you can see, the syntax is quite simplified. It is just saying that for each string name inside names, print out the name. Okay, so it will give each value of names, that is Pankaj, Sagar, Akash, Pooja, Archana, inside the names array, and from this names array it will give each value. It will first give Pankaj to name and print it out, then give Sagar to name, then print it out, then give Akash to name and then print it out, Pooja to name, and Archana to name, print that out. If I right click on this and say run as Java application, the output is same, but as you can see, the syntax is very simplified. This was about the for each loop. Let's try to have some exceptions over here. I'll say int n1 equals to 10, int n2 equals to 0. Let's try to divide them, n1 by n2, and let's try to put over here program is exiting. Okay, so will this statement work or not? Let's try to run and see. I'll right click run as Java application. As you can see, there are two things happening over here. First thing is that it gave you an error in a red color statement saying exception in main divide by 0 exception. Okay, now understand this thing as well. The output of the program, that is program is exiting, is not printed because the point from where Java sees an error in your code, it will stop the execution from that point immediately. So everything that follows that line will not be executed. If I want to execute it, let's have a try catch block. Let's cut this thing and paste it over here. I'll say catch exception ex. So in case of any exception, I'll just say system.out.println ex.get message. So let's see what is the output of this. Now see, you have two things happening over here as well. First of all, it sees an error over here. So what it does, it catches the error inside the exception ex and it prints the message of the exception, that is divide by 0. But the program does not hold over there. The program continues the execution and gives the output as program is exiting at the end line. This indicates that the complete code has been executed and you are able to provide the complete output without any errors. This is the example of runtime errors. If you have a code that can have an error somewhere, you just put that code inside the try block. In case of the error, what precaution you have to follow, give it inside the catch block and then write your normal program.